The crack in the crystal glass was exactly the width of a single hair, and Ruby Hale was the only person in the Belcourt room who saw it. Not the piano humming softly in the corner, not the smell of browned butter and thyme drifting from the kitchen, not the first snow of the season settling against the Beacon Hill windows, just a crack so faint it was nearly invisible, one that 20 other people had picked up and set back down without ever noticing. Ruby noticed the things everyone else missed, because that's how a 26-year-old woman, orphaned, young, and working 2 shifts a day to support a little brother with a heart condition, had learned to survive, see everything, and never be allowed to speak. In the frayed pocket of her apron, she kept a linen handkerchief embroidered with the letter R, the only thing left of the mother she'd buried. That evening, a quiet man named August Fenn brought his mother into the restaurant the way he did every Friday night, a 71-year-old woman who'd once taught piano and was now drifting deeper into the white fog of Alzheimer's. August was 34, broad-shouldered, with eyes the cold gray of steel, and the whole elegant room went still when he walked in, though no one dared say aloud who the soft-spoken man really was. Then Cordelia Whitlock arrived, a 48-year-old woman in a cream-colored mink coat, her platinum hair set hard, designer sunglasses pushed up into it even though night had already fallen, a woman accustomed to a world that bent to her. She didn't know who the quiet man was, and she couldn't be bothered to care, because if she had, perhaps she wouldn't have thrown out her arm to shove an old, confused woman who'd wandered too close to her table, shoved her hard enough that the old woman pitched sideways and fell toward the poor waitress standing nearest. The musician in the corner was still easing into the slow movement of a nocturne, and the music hadn't yet realized what had happened before both women were down on the marble floor. What Cordelia Whitlock didn't understand, what the entire room was about to understand, was that the frail woman she'd just knocked down was August Fenn's mother, and the reckoning, as it turned out, wouldn't have to wait long. If you believe a person's dignity is never measured by the money in their account, hit like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that touch the heart each week. Now settle in and get comfortable, because the story's only just beginning. 6 hours before that granite floor witnessed what no one could have foreseen, Ruby Hale stepped through the back door of the Belcourt room from the snow-covered alley, where the heat from the kitchen vent dissolved into the cold air in thin coils of white smoke. She arrived 20 minutes early, as she did for every shift, because 20 minutes early was enough time for a person like her never to be caught looking rushed. And Ruby had learned long ago that the best server was the one guests never had to notice. She hung her thin coat on a hook in the cramped changing room, tied her auburn hair back at the nape of her neck, fastened the black apron whose edges had begun to fray, and stood before the fogged mirror just long enough to make sure no crease in her collar betrayed her. In the pocket of her apron, the linen handkerchief rested quietly, where it always rested, a small weight only she knew was there. Outside, the main dining room was being prepared for Friday night, and Ruby stepped into the silent order she knew by heart, down to every rhythm. The sound of silver knives and forks being lined up straight, the sound of linen napkins being folded into sharp-edged triangles, the electric candlelight glimmering over crystal glasses polished until they were almost invisible. She began her work in her assigned section, wiping each glass with a lint-free cloth, holding it under the light to search for watermarks, and it was while doing this that her eyes stopped half a second longer than usual on a glass at table number 9. But manager Ted Morrow, calling her name from near the counter, pulled her away before she could think any further. Ted was a 50-year-old man, with the face of someone who had spent his entire life soothing difficult guests and hiding his own exhaustion. And tonight he was tenser than usual, running his finger over the reservation book, as though the names inside it were a problem with no solution. He warned her about a regular guest arriving at 8 o'clock, a special guest he emphasized in a voice so low that Ruby had to lean closer. A gentleman who always sat at table number 9, always came with his elderly mother, and always needed to be served with absolute discretion. No questions, no eagerness, only quiet and careful attention. Ruby nodded, remembered, and asked nothing more, because asking nothing more was the first skill she had trained herself to master in this profession. The dining room gradually warmed as the first guests stepped in from the snow, bringing with them the cold still clinging to their shoulders and the scent of perfume mixed with wine, and Ruby moved among them like a useful shadow, pouring water, changing plates, picking up a fallen napkin before the guest even realized it had fallen. She saw everything other people overlooked. The man at table number 4 constantly glancing at his watch, because he was waiting for a message that wasn't coming. The couple at table number 7, sitting in the silence of two people, who had run out of things to say, the woman at table number 12, touching her neck whenever she felt anxious, and a boy of about 5, sitting with his parents in the corner near the window, drawing invisible circles on the tabletop with one tiny finger. Ruby registered all of it without trying, because observation, for her, wasn't a choice but a habit buried deep, a way to stay half a step ahead, to never be caught missing a beat, to keep herself in that fragile place between being useful and being invisible that this job demanded. Somewhere inside her, a vague worry about something that had to be taken care of before the end of the month hummed quietly like the vibration of a tightly held string, but she was used to pressing it down beneath the discipline of the shift, not allowing it to show on her face, not allowing it to slow her hands. The piano in the corner began to sound when the musician sat down, the first notes of what would be a long evening, and Ruby glanced at the clock hanging above the kitchen counter, its hands nearly at 7:30, then drew in a very soft breath, straightened her apron, and stepped back out into the dining room, unaware that in less than an hour, her habit of seeing everything would force her to do the one thing her profession had taught her never to do: speak up. Ruby's break came at 7:40, barely 10 minutes between two waves of guests, and she slipped through the side door onto the small porch where the staff usually stood to smoke. Though she didn't smoke, she only needed a place to breathe. Snow was still falling slowly into the alley, settling on the shoulders of the thin sweater she had hastily put on, and she pulled her phone from her apron pocket, tapping a number she knew better than her own name. The phone rang twice before a child's voice sounded on the other end, a little hoarse, a little tired, but still trying to sound cheerful, in the way only children forced to grow up too soon know how to pretend, and Ruby immediately felt the knot in her chest loosen a little. Eli had just turned 12 that past autumn. Although he was more than 300 kilometers away in the small house in Vermont, where their elderly aunt looked after him, his voice could still pull Ruby back to the only feeling that resembled home she had left. She asked whether he had eaten dinner, whether he had taken his medicine on time, whether he had felt tired climbing the stairs today, and he answered each question one by one, in the tone of someone far too used to being asked them, then steered the conversation toward the stray cat that had been wandering near the porch, toward the math homework he had managed to do by himself without anyone's help, toward the promise that he would behave and wouldn't make their aunt worry. Ruby leaned back against the cold brick wall, smiling to herself in the dark, and in that moment, she let memory slide back to the afternoon 2 years earlier, when everything changed, when their mother, a thin woman whose hands had always been warm no matter how brutal the winter became, had held Ruby's hand for the last time and told her in a breath already too weak that no matter what happened, she had to hold on to the boy, because they had only each other left. That mother had not left much behind. No money, no house of any worth, only a linen handkerchief she had embroidered with the letter R in the corner many years before, when her eyes could still see the path of the needle clearly, and she had pressed it into Ruby's palm, as though passing on a promise rather than an object. Since that day, the handkerchief had never left her. It lay in her apron pocket through all those long shifts, a small piece of cloth carrying the warmth of a hand that was no longer there, and every time Ruby's fingers accidentally brushed against it while she was rushing between tables, she remembered why she was standing here, why she bowed her head and endured, why she accepted being an invisible shadow in a room full of people who would never look at her twice. Eli was the reason, the only reason, and the whole reason, and everything Ruby did flowed back to that one point, the way every stream finds its riverbed. She told her brother she would try to visit during the coming break, that she was saving so he could see a better doctor in the city, and her voice softened on that last sentence, not because she wanted to hide it, but because there were things an older sister didn't want her little brother to hear the worry inside. She didn't hear the side door open softly behind her, didn't know that a broad-shouldered man had stepped out onto the porch to escape the noise of the dining room and was standing quietly at the other end, also holding a phone to his ear for a call of his own, close enough to accidentally hear a few of her final words, close enough to catch the name Eli and the nearly breaking softness in the voice of a sister trying to hold herself together. The man didn't look toward her, didn't show that he had heard. He only turned his face away with the discretion of someone who understood very well what a private moment was and why it shouldn't be intruded upon. But something in that voice anchored itself in his memory, a small fragment he would later remember at exactly the moment it became important. Ruby said goodbye to her brother, told him to go to bed early, then stood for one more second in the falling snow, breathing in the sharp cold as though to harden the shell she needed to wear before going back inside. And when she slipped the phone into her apron pocket again, her fingers brushed once more against the handkerchief. Then she pushed the door open and stepped back in, returning to the person this world allowed her to be. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the front door of the Belcourt room opened, and something in the room changed before Ruby even had time to look that way. She noticed the change first through other people, the way she had always read the world, through the way the conversations at a few tables near the entrance softened by half a beat, through the way Ted Morrow hurriedly set down the reservation book and went out to greet the guests himself instead of letting the hostess do it, through the way an older waiter unconsciously straightened his back as though someone had just reminded him of his posture. The man who entered wasn't large in a showy way, but there was an invisible weight in the way he moved, a stillness that made the space around him seem to widen and make room, and Ruby understood at once that this was the regular guest Ted had warned her about in that tense whisper at the beginning of the shift. He looked about 34, broad-shouldered beneath a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without a single wrinkle, his black hair touched with a few early strands of silver and combed neatly back, and his gray eyes had the cold color of cooled steel, the gaze of a man accustomed to seeing through every room he entered within the first few seconds. But what caught Ruby's attention wasn't that aura of authority. It was the arm he was supporting, because walking beside him, holding his elbow with both frail hands, there was a small elderly woman with snow-white hair gathered neatly in a bun and a pale blue wool shawl draped over her shoulders. The old woman walked slowly, every step uncertain, as though the floor beneath her feet wasn't entirely trustworthy, and her eyes moved around the room with the gentle confusion of someone who wasn't sure where she was, but was still trying to be polite to an unfamiliar place. The man didn't show the slightest trace of impatience. He slowed himself to match his mother's pace, bent his head whenever she looked up to say something, and Ruby saw him nod patiently at words she guessed probably followed no logical thread, answering with an expression that held no irritation or embarrassment. Only a tenderness carefully protected the way someone protects a candle in the wind. Ted led them to table number 9, in a quiet corner overlooking the snow-covered window, and the man pulled out his mother's chair himself, supported her elbow as she sat, adjusted the shawl that had slipped from one shoulder, with a movement so gentle, almost no one noticed, and only then did he sit down in the chair across from her. The whole room seemed to return to its normal rhythm, the sound of knives and forks, soft laughter, the piano murmuring in the corner, but Ruby could still feel a thin layer of tension lingering in the air. The way people sat a little straighter, lowered their voices a little more near table number 9, as if everyone silently understood something about that man without anyone daring to say it aloud. A formless kind of caution settling over the dining room like mist. Ruby didn't know who he was, and by professional instinct, she didn't allow herself to be curious, but she couldn't help noticing the way the old woman suddenly reached across the table and took her son's hand, gripping it with a flash of panic like a lost child, and the way the man immediately placed his other hand over hers, sheltering her trembling fingers, leaning forward to say something so quietly that the alarm on her face slowly dissolved and was replaced by a vague smile. In that room full of wealthy guests, used to giving orders and being served, the sight of that silent man patiently soothing his aging mother felt so out of place that it almost made people look away, because it was too real in a place where everything was arranged. Ruby stood close to the edge of her service section, still holding the water pitcher, and for a moment she forgot she was observing with the eyes of a server. Instead, she looked at that man with a feeling she couldn't name, a faint recognition that beneath the shell of power the whole room was wary of, there was a son doing the simplest and hardest thing in the world, not abandoning the woman who had given birth to him, even as she was slowly forgetting who he was. They had just finished ordering when the phone in the man's breast pocket vibrated. Ruby could tell from the way he lowered his head to look at the screen that it wasn't a call he could ignore. His jaw tightened briefly, a subtle shift, but enough for her to notice. He didn't get up right away. Instead, he leaned down and said a few reassuring words to his mother, gently patted the back of her hand, then swept his eyes across the service area, and that gaze stopped directly on Ruby, the only person standing close enough and attentive enough. He signaled softly with a tilt of his head, and when she stepped over, he rose, lowered his voice very low, and spoke to her with a kind of courtesy she didn't often encounter in powerful guests, saying that he had to step into the lobby to take an important phone call for a few minutes. that his mother sometimes became confused when left alone in a crowded place, and asking whether she could keep an eye on her for him until he returned. Ruby nodded, said she would be glad to, and she noticed a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as though asking a stranger to watch over the most precious thing he had was something he wasn't used to doing and didn't do lightly. But then he nodded his thanks with the slightest bow of his head and walked quickly toward the outer lobby. Ruby pulled an empty chair a little closer to table number 9. Not sitting down because that wouldn't be proper, but standing quietly beside it within reach, and the old woman lifted her head to look at her with cloudy, questioning eyes, then asked in a trembling voice where her son had gone, whether he would come back. Ruby bent down to meet her at eye level, smiled very gently, and said that her son had only stepped out for a little while. He would be right back, and for now she should just sit there comfortably, because Ruby was here with her. Something in Ruby's soft, unhurried voice seemed to reach the old woman, because the fingers that had been clutching the edge of the tablecloth slowly loosened, and she nodded like a child who had been soothed, then looked at Ruby intently for a long while before saying that Ruby had hands like someone she had once known, though she couldn't remember who it was. Ruby didn't correct her, didn't press her with questions, only poured a little more warm water into her glass and set it exactly where her hand could reach it easily. The kind of quiet care she had given 1,000 times to 1,000 guests, though this time there was something more in it, something that wasn't duty, but something close to compassion. Meanwhile, out in the lobby, the man stood with his back turned to the dining room, the phone pressed to his ear, and he didn't know that the place where he was standing was where, only minutes earlier, a young woman had spoken to her younger brother in the falling snow, and he had not yet connected in his mind that the server watching over his mother now was the same soft voice mentioning the name Eli that he had accidentally heard before, a fragment still lying loose in his memory, not yet fitting anywhere, but already there. Back at table number 9, something unexpected happened, because the musician in the corner had just shifted into a new melody, an old piece, slow and gentle, and the moment the first notes trembled through the air, the old woman's face changed completely. The confusion dissolved like mist meeting sunlight. Her cloudy eyes suddenly brightened with a light Ruby had not yet seen in her, and she sat up straighter, her head tilting slightly toward the music like a flower turning toward the source of light, her lips moving faintly with each note, as though she knew that song down to its every breath. Ruby followed her gaze toward the piano in the corner, and she couldn't help wondering who this small woman, now slowly forgetting even her son's face, had once been, what kind of life she had lived before that white fog began to carry her away. And in that moment, without knowing it, Ruby crossed the invisible line between a server and a human being who was simply caring about another human being. The old woman kept following the sound of the piano for a long while. Then she turned to Ruby and said, in a voice that was suddenly so clear and coherent it surprised her, that it was a nocturne, and that the musician was playing the middle passage a little too quickly, the place where each note should have been allowed to ring on its own before being released into the next. Ruby asked softly whether she knew music, and the old woman's face brightened with a gentle pride as she told her she had taught piano for nearly 40 years. In a small room with a window overlooking a row of maple trees, where one class of students after another had sat on her old piano bench and learned how to turn the black dots on a page into something that could breathe. She said her name was Margaret, and she repeated that name twice, as though reassuring herself that at least that much she could still keep. Then she told Ruby, sometimes clearly and sometimes in broken fragments, about afternoons when sunlight slanted through the window and rested on the keys, about the smell of wood and polishing wax, about the way a timid child could sit down full of fear and stand up after 1 hour with entirely different eyes. Ruby listened without interrupting, without hurrying to pull her back into reality the way many people did with people like her, only nodding and asking the right questions at the right moments, because she understood by instinct that what the old woman needed wasn't to be corrected, but to be heard as a person whose dignity was still whole. Then, in the middle of that stream of memory, Margaret's eyes suddenly stopped on some distant point beyond the snow-covered window, and her voice sank as she said she had once taught piano to a little girl with tiny fingers, and a heart too large for her small body, a little girl she had loved more than all her other students put together, a daughter she had never stopped missing for even a single day. She didn't say clearly what had happened, and Ruby didn't ask, because there are silences in a person's story that you understand you shouldn't step into, and the old woman only added that the little girl had gone far away from her a very long time ago. So long ago that sometimes she wondered whether she still remembered that face correctly, or whether memory had begun redrawing it with the features she wished to see. There was a sorrow in her voice so deep it reached beyond even the fog of illness, as though this was one of the last things the disease had not yet been able to take from her. A mark carved too deeply to be erased, and Ruby felt her throat tighten, because she recognized in this stranger's longing something that echoed her own loss, the empty space a beloved person leaves behind that is never truly filled. She reached out and rested her hand lightly on Margaret's wrinkled one, saying nothing, because sometimes no words are enough, and a shared silence says more. And the old woman turned back to look at her, her eyes wet with tears while her mouth still smiled. Then she gave Ruby's hand a gentle squeeze, and said she was a kind girl, that not everyone would sit and listen to a foolish old woman telling stories. Ruby shook her head and said she wasn't foolish at all, that she was simply carrying an entire life inside her, one not everyone was lucky enough to have lived, and those words seemed to touch some very deep place in Margaret, because she closed her eyes for a moment as if to keep them safe. The piano was still murmuring in the corner, and Margaret tilted her head toward it again, her thin fingers moving faintly across the tablecloth in an invisible rhythm, tracing the keys only she could see, while Ruby stood there quietly keeping watch over her, unaware that in only a few minutes, this fragile piece would be torn open by someone who had never learned how to look at other people as human beings. That piece began to crack from the front door, where a rush of cold air swept in together, with a shrill voice that had already risen before its owner had even fully stepped into the dining room, a voice made not for conversation but for command, for forcing an entire room to turn and look. The woman entered as though this restaurant had been built solely to await her arrival. Wrapped in an expensive cream-colored mink coat, her platinum blonde hair set into stiff curls without a single strand out of place, designer sunglasses still perched carelessly on top of her head, though night had long since fallen outside and the snow was coming down, a small detail that said everything about a person more accustomed to displaying herself than to seeing clearly. Her name was Cordelia Whitlock, though no one in the room knew it yet, and she brushed the young hostess aside with a flick of her hand as if shooing away a fly, her eyes sweeping over the dining room with the possessive look of someone who had come to inspect her own property. Ted Morrow hurried out to greet her, wearing the professional smile polished by years of practice. But that smile hadn't even fully formed before Cordelia cut him off, declaring that she had reserved a table by the window, a specific table she had made very clear over the phone, not some little corner where people intended to shove her. Ted gently explained that the window table she meant was already occupied, but he would be very happy to arrange another table for her that was just as lovely, and no sooner had he finished than Cordelia let out a cold little scoff, saying she didn't care who was sitting there, that the other guests should be moved somewhere else, because she had been a regular at the finest establishments in the city since before this ordinary little restaurant had even opened its doors. The dining room sank into that particular kind of silence belonging to people trying their hardest not to be pulled in, guests lowering their eyes to their plates, dropping their voices, pretending not to hear, because no one wanted to become the next target of a rage that had no reason. Ted still managed to keep his composure, leading her to a fine table near the middle of the room. But as soon as Cordelia sat down, she complained that the table was too close to the aisle, then that the lighting was too dim. Then, when the server poured her a taste of wine according to the proper ritual, she swirled the glass, took a sip, grimaced, and announced that this was undrinkable, that it had either gone bad or been stored at the wrong temperature, then pushed the glass away with disgust, as though someone had dared insult her refined taste. The young server stammered an apology and promised to bring another bottle, but that didn't satisfy Cordelia either, because satisfaction had never been what she was truly searching for. What she wanted was the feeling of making other people submit, of seeing them bend, and each apology only made her press farther. When Ted returned to the table to try to soothe the situation once more, Cordelia leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms over her chest, and lowered her voice by a degree that made it more dangerous than when she had been shouting, telling him he should be careful about how he treated her, because she knew people who could have this restaurant shut down with a single phone call, that her husband sat at tables with the people who owned half the city's financial district, and that she would remember his face, remember it very clearly. Ted went a little pale, but he still bowed his head politely and stepped back, because he was an employee, and employees understood very well the cost of talking back to a guest who could truly cause trouble, and that forced restraint of his only confirmed in Cordelia's eyes that she was right, that the world operated the way she wanted it to, that money and connections were the shield that meant she would never have to suffer consequences for anything she did. From the corner of the room, Ruby stood beside table number 9 and watched all of it, with a vague unease rising in her chest. The instinct of someone used to reading storms before they broke, and she instinctively shifted a little closer to Margaret, as though wanting to use her own body to shield the old woman from something she couldn't yet name, but could already feel drawing very near. At the table in the corner near the window, the young couple with a little boy of about 5 had exchanged a quiet look, the kind of look parents use to speak to each other without words, saying it was time to go, and the mother gently folded her napkin, bent down, and whispered to her son that the two of them would wait out in the lobby while his father paid the bill, where there was a warm fireplace and his grandmother would be calling. The boy obediently slipped down from his chair, took his mother's hand, and she led him quickly toward the outer lobby, away from the tension rising in the dining room, a tension her mother's instinct had sensed even before it had time to erupt into anything, because there are things adults are forced to witness, but a child shouldn't have to. The father lingered a little longer to finish the meal before following them, leaving behind the empty table where, only moments earlier, there had still been the clear laughter of a child. Now there were only adults left in the dining room, and the stage had been cleared for what was about to happen, though no one could yet imagine it. At the table in the middle of the room, Cordelia Whitlock sat sipping her second glass of wine, which she still judged as acceptable but not good, and if anyone had been patient enough to look through that arrogant shell, they might have seen something more pitiful than hateful. Cordelia had grown up in a family that had once been wealthy, part of the old upper class of the region, raised by people who believed a person's worth was measured by bloodline and property, and from childhood she had been taught that there were two kinds of people in the world, those who gave orders and those who obeyed, and that her duty was never to fall into the second kind. She had married a powerful man in finance not because of love, but because it was expected, and through all the years that followed, she had learned to fill the widening emptiness inside herself with things that could be bought: fur coats, lavish vacations, dinners in places where people had to say her name with respect. But deep underneath, there was a truth even Cordelia didn't dare face, that no one in her glittering world truly liked her, that the people surrounding her only surrounded her husband's name and wallet, and the obedience she demanded from servers, employees, and those she considered beneath her was the only thing that still made her feel she had any real power in a life she had never truly chosen for herself. She despised working people not because they had done anything wrong, but because their existence reminded her of the thing she feared most, that if money and status were stripped away from her, she would be no different from them, a bare human being with nothing to cling to, and that fear had turned into cruelty, because being cruel to those weaker than oneself is the easiest way for an empty person to convince herself she is still powerful. Tonight, sitting in this unfamiliar restaurant while her husband was somewhere in a late meeting and would only arrive later, Cordelia felt an unpleasant restlessness rising inside her that she couldn't understand, a feeling of being overlooked, of not being treated as her rank deserved, and she swept her eyes around the dining room in search of something to pour that feeling onto, a target, an excuse. Her gaze passed over the guests, deliberately avoiding looking at her, passed over the server standing tucked away in a far corner, and then stopped at table number 9, where a silver-haired old woman sat alone, her head tilted toward the music with a look of confusion, and inside Cordelia's mind, something small and poisonous began to take shape, though she herself had not yet realized she was preparing to do something that could never be taken back. At that very moment, Ted Morrow signaled to Ruby from the other side of the room, where a group of guests had just ordered more dishes and needed to be served immediately, and Ruby hesitated for a brief second, glancing at Margaret sitting peacefully with her head tilted toward the music, then told herself she would only be gone for 1 minute, that the old woman was calm and safe, and that she would come right back. She moved quickly to the other table, both hands carrying a tray, bending to set each plate down with practiced skill, but all the while part of her mind remained at table number 9, that habit of keeping watch already rooted in her blood, and that was why, when she happened to glance toward the corner of the room, her heart suddenly dropped. Table number 9 was empty. In the brief moment Ruby had turned her back, the piano in the corner had drifted into another melody, a piece of music that seemed to Margaret like a summons from the past, and the old woman had slowly risen from her chair, her cloudy eyes now filled with a strange certainty that she was in her old music room, that the music was being played by a student waiting for her instruction. She felt her way along the backs of chairs, taking hesitant but purposeful steps toward the piano in the corner. And that path led her past the table in the middle of the room where Cordelia Whitlock was sitting. And as she moved, Margaret's thin hand reached out for balance and accidentally brushed against the shoulder of the cream-colored mink coat. A light, trembling, completely harmless touch from an elderly woman trying not to fall. Cordelia whipped around as though she had been burned, her face twisting with disgust as she saw the silver-haired old woman standing unsteadily beside her, her bewildered eyes unaware that she had disturbed anyone. Not a flicker of compassion, not a second of hesitation to wonder whether the aging woman in front of her was all right, whether she needed help. Cordelia saw only an invasion of her space, something she considered filthy, daring to touch her expensive coat, and she unleashed a stream of cruel words in that shrill voice, loud enough for the whole corner of the room to hear. She said that people were letting this kind of person wander around now, that a respectable restaurant shouldn't allow senile old things who no longer knew where they were to roam freely among decent guests, that perhaps this old woman ought to be locked away somewhere instead of forcing Cordelia to endure being disturbed during her dinner. Margaret stood there, receiving all those words without fully understanding them, but she understood the tone, the harshness and contempt in its sound, and the old woman's face began to change, the vague joy of the music room fading away, replaced by the frightened confusion of a child being scolded without knowing what she had done wrong, her lips trembling, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. She staggered back one step, her mouth stammering a wordless apology, her hands fumbling for something to hold on to, and her confused panic only irritated Cordelia further, because for a person like her, another person's weakness did not awaken pity, only disgust. From the other side of the room, Ruby had seen everything in a single instant, the tray in her hands nearly slipping as she realized table number 9 was empty, and Margaret was standing alone in the middle of the room, under the hail of vicious words from the woman in the mink coat, and fear mixed with guilt rose in her until she could hardly breathe, because she had promised the son she would watch over his mother, and in just one careless minute, everything had turned into this. She hurriedly set the tray down on the nearest table and rushed toward the middle of the room, weaving between chairs, her heart pounding, and she stepped in between Margaret and Cordelia, one hand taking the old woman's trembling elbow to keep her from falling, then lifted her eyes to face Cordelia, and in the gentle but firm voice she was trying so hard to keep calm, she asked the woman to please settle down, that this was only a misunderstanding, that the old woman had meant no harm at all. Cordelia slowly turned to look at her, cold eyes sweeping from the fraying black apron up to Ruby's face, and a scornful smile slowly appeared on her lips. That scornful smile said everything before Cordelia even opened her mouth, because it was the smile of someone who had just found a new and more fitting target for her rage, someone even lower than the old woman on the ladder she had built inside her own mind. She asked Ruby, in a drawn-out voice full of mockery, since when did a little serving girl have the right to lecture her on how to behave? Who did Ruby think she was to dare interfere, that a waitress's job was to pour water and clear plates, not open her mouth and meddle in the affairs of people from a class she would never reach in her entire life? Ruby felt those words strike her like lashes, and something hot rose in her throat, the instinct to answer back, to defend herself, but she swallowed it down, the way she had swallowed things down 1,000 times throughout all the years she had done this work, because she understood that in this room, in this world, a person wearing a black apron who argued with a person wearing a mink coat would always be the one in the wrong, no matter what the truth was. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She only stood upright, one hand still supporting Margaret's trembling elbow as the old woman pressed close to her, and she said in a soft voice that did not tremble that she was very sorry if she had disturbed the lady, that she had meant no disrespect, but this elderly woman was frightened and needed help, and her job, just as the lady had said, was to care for the guests in this restaurant, including the guest standing here. That calm reply seemed to make Cordelia even angrier, because she had expected fear, shrinking, submission to satisfy her, and instead she received a quiet dignity that money couldn't buy and power couldn't break, and that drove her mad. She stepped forward, lowering her voice into something poisonous and whispering, saying that people like Ruby were born to serve and would die serving, that she had nothing, was no one, only a nameless shadow no one would remember tomorrow, while one phone call from Cordelia could cost her this job tonight and make sure no respectable restaurant in this city ever dared hire her again. Ruby heard every word, and she had to admit that they touched a very real fear inside her, because she had nothing to support her if she lost this job, no safety net, no one behind her to fall back on, and for one moment that fear almost made her step away. But then she felt Margaret's frail hand tightening around her arm, felt the old woman's small, trembling body leaning against her in search of protection, and she understood that if she let go now and walked away to save herself, she would lose something even more precious than her job, something her mother had handed down to her along with the handkerchief embroidered with the letter R, the self-respect of a human being brave enough to stand on the side of what was right, even when it came at a cost. She didn't move, didn't release Margaret. She only looked straight into Cordelia's eyes without challenge and without surrender, and said that the lady could do whatever she wanted with Ruby's job, but right now Ruby wouldn't abandon someone who needed help, and that was what she would do no matter who the lady was. The whole corner of the room went still in a silence stretched tight as a violin string. A few guests had lifted their heads to watch. A few were whispering softly, and Ted Morrow was hurrying over from the distance with his face pale with worry. But it was already too late, because Cordelia Whitlock, with her pride wounded and her anger beyond her own control, could no longer see anything except two lower people daring to defy her, and her ring-covered hand had already begun to swing through the air. In the corner of the room, the pianist had just entered the slowest passage of the nocturne, the passage where each note was released and allowed to linger for a long time before the next one spoke, and Ruby would remember something strange about that moment for the rest of her life. That in her memory there had been no other sound but the piano, as though the whole world had been retold according to the rhythm of the music. The first note rang out, and Cordelia's ring-covered hand swung through the air in anger, a contemptuous shooing motion aimed at the old woman standing unsteadily there, not meant to strike but to push her out of the way one moves an obstacle. Yet for a frail elderly woman who was only staying upright by holding onto Ruby's arm, one forceful shove was already more than enough. The second note rang out, and Ruby felt Margaret's small body sway beneath that push, felt the hand clinging to her suddenly slip from her arm as the old woman lost her balance and began falling backward, toward the cold, hard granite floor, and in that split second, everything inside Ruby narrowed into a single instinct, an instinct older than fear. The third note rang out, and Ruby had already thrown herself forward, without one instant of calculation, without 1 second of thought, almost hurling her whole body down so she could slip between the old woman's fragile back and the hard stone floor, wrapping both arms around Margaret and twisting herself so that her own back and shoulder would hit the floor first, so her body would become the cushion, shielding the little woman she had promised to watch over. The fourth note rang out, gentle and tender, as though the music still had no idea what had just happened in the room, still murmuring its own story about some beautiful sorrow, and by then, both women were on the granite floor, Ruby underneath with Margaret's whole body held tight in her arms, supported, protected, almost untouched by the floor. The impact drove into Ruby's shoulder and hip, a sharp burst of pain spreading along her spine, but she didn't loosen her hold, didn't release the woman she was holding, because the only thing she thought about in that moment wasn't her own pain, but whether the old woman was all right. The room broke open from its silence, and Ruby felt it more than heard it, through the shadows of people springing up from their chairs, through someone crying out in horror, through an elderly diner lifting a hand to cover his mouth, through Ted Morrow's ashen face as he rushed toward them, through the way the space around her suddenly filled with panicked motion. She didn't see all of it because her eyes were fixed entirely on Margaret's face, so close above her own, and what she read there made her heart tighten, because the old woman's eyes were wide with terror and disorientation, her lips trembling violently, her whole body shaking in Ruby's arms like a leaf in a storm. Ruby forced her voice to soften as much as she could, whispering into the old woman's ear that she was safe now, that Ruby was here with her, that it was all right, repeating the words again and again like a spell while trying to push herself up and still keep the old woman's body cradled with care. Above them, Cordelia Whitlock stood frozen for a moment, the hand she had swung still hovering in the air, and across her face passed an expression perhaps even she did not recognize, not quite remorse, but the stunned instant of a person who had just done something whose consequences even she hadn't foreseen, before the familiar shell of arrogance immediately rose again to hide it. But the entire room had seen it. Dozens of pairs of eyes had witnessed it, and the air thickened in that suspended moment between what had just happened and what was about to come, the moment before the real storm came crashing down. Ruby finally managed to push herself upright on the cold stone floor, her back braced against the leg of a table, and she pulled Margaret into her lap, holding the trembling old woman as though she were holding a child. One hand supporting the back of her neck, the other wrapped around the thin shoulders, shaking in waves. She couldn't clearly hear what was happening around her, because her ears were still ringing from the fall, but she could read all of it on the faces surrounding them, the way the entire room retold its horror to her in the language of expressions. The elderly diner at the next table was still standing, rooted in place with one hand over his mouth, his eyes wide and unblinking. A woman farther away had turned her face completely aside, unable to bear the sight, her shoulders trembling. Ted Morrow dropped to his knees beside them, his lips moving again and again with words Ruby could only dimly catch, his face white as paper, his hands hovering helplessly, not knowing where to place themselves. The pianist in the corner had stopped playing without anyone noticing when, his fingers still suspended above the keys, and the sudden silence after the music died felt heavier than any scream. And then, in the middle of that frozen scene, Margaret suddenly clutched the front of Ruby's uniform with both hands, lifted her tear-soaked face to look at her, and from the old woman's trembling lips came a name, a daughter's name called with all the desperation and love of a heart that had carried that longing through an entire lifetime. She called that name again, and then again, and she pressed her face into Ruby's shoulder, confusing the girl holding her with a figure from the distant past, the daughter she had never stopped missing for even one day. The daughter who had gone far away from her long ago and left inside her a hollow space that even the cruel disease erasing everything else from her mind couldn't erase. She whispered that she had been looking for her for so long that she thought she had lost her, that she mustn't leave her mother again, and every word cut into Ruby's heart like a blade because she understood that she was standing in a sacred and painful place inside the soul of a stranger, a place money couldn't buy, power couldn't touch, a place where only the barest grief of motherhood lived. Ruby didn't correct her, didn't say she was mistaken, because in that moment it no longer mattered, and instead she held her tighter, laid one hand on her silver hair, and stroked it softly the way someone soothes a child, whispering into her ear that she had found her now, that everything was all right, that she wasn't alone anymore. She allowed the old woman to believe what she needed to believe, allowed her to cling to the warmth of human arms in the moment she needed it most. And Ruby's own tears began to fall without her even realizing it, sinking into the silver hair of the woman sobbing in her lap. The guests who witnessed that scene, adults long accustomed to hiding their feelings in public, could no longer keep their composure. Some quietly wiped the corners of their eyes, some turned away and swallowed hard, because what stood before them was no longer a noisy altercation, but something so naked and holy it made them feel small, the image of a poor girl in a black apron holding a confused, wealthy old woman in her arms, giving her something all the riches in the world couldn't buy, the feeling of being seen as a human being, of being comforted, of being loved without condition in the weakest moment of her life. And at the edge of that scene, no one noticed that the broad-shouldered man, who had just stepped back in from the outer lobby, had frozen at the dining room threshold, his phone fallen from his hand, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the sight of his mother, sobbing in the arms of a stranger. For one long moment that felt endless, August Fenn only stood there at the threshold, motionless, his gray eyes slowly taking in the whole scene before him, his mother sobbing on the floor in the arms of a girl wearing an apron, the pale blue wool shawl slipped from her shoulders and lying across the cold stone, and the son's face did not twist with rage, but instead became frighteningly still, the stillness of water just before a great storm tears it open. He didn't shout, didn't rush forward, didn't make a single unnecessary movement. He only began to walk, one step at a time, slowly crossing the dining room toward his mother. And it was precisely that calm slowness that sent a chill down the spine of the whole room more than any roar could have done, because there was a force radiating from him in that moment that made everyone who met his eyes instinctively step back or lower their head. Ted Morrow was the first to look up and see him, and the manager's reaction said everything, because his already pale face now went so white there was no color left in it, and he sprang up, stammering Mr. Fenn's name in the voice of a man who had just realized disaster had climbed to an entirely different level. And the way Ted bent his body in a bow, the way his hands shook, sent a wave of recognition spreading through the surrounding tables. A middle-aged man seated nearby, who until then had been trying to maintain an air of indifference, suddenly went pale, when he clearly saw August's face, and he hurriedly tugged at his wife's sleeve, leaning close to whisper something in her ear that made her immediately lift a hand to cover her mouth and look at August with both astonishment and fear. That whisper began passing from table to table, like an underground ripple. Names carried in voices so low they were almost soundless. Quick glances flicking toward the silent man, and then hurrying away again as though afraid of being caught looking. And though no one said aloud who he was, that identity had already filled the thick air of the room like an unmistakable scent. The name of a man people in this city mentioned only with fearful respect, a man who stood at the head of forces operating in the shadows, a man even the wealthiest and most powerful did not want as an enemy. Ruby, still sitting on the floor with Margaret in her arms, felt the room change before she understood the reason, felt the way fear had suddenly taken on a new shape, and when she looked up at the man approaching, she recognized him as the guest who had asked her to watch over his mother, the gentle son who had pulled out his mother's chair and adjusted her shawl. But now what radiated from him was something entirely different, a restrained power boiling beneath the surface of his composure. August dropped to one knee beside his mother and Ruby, and in that first moment, he didn't look at Cordelia at all, didn't waste a single second on the woman who had caused all of this, but gave all his attention to his mother, his large hand trembling in a rare way as he cradled her tear-soaked face, calling her softly, "Mother, it's me. I'm here now." Margaret was still lost in confusion. She looked at her son with eyes that had not yet recognized him, still calling the daughter's name from her grief, and Ruby saw something in the man's steel-gray eyes break for one split second when he heard his mother speak that name, an old and fathomless pain he had buried long ago, before he managed to pull himself back and hide it. Then August turned to Ruby, and for the first time he looked directly at her, his eyes passing over the crooked apron, over the scrape on her elbow where it had struck the stone floor, over the way she was still holding his mother tightly, still protecting her even though she herself had taken the full force of the fall. And in his eyes, beneath the fury he was holding back, something else appeared, a recognition, a gratitude so deep that no words could express it, for the strange girl who had done for his mother the one thing he had not been there to do. While the whole room held its breath watching the man kneeling beside his mother, Cordelia Whitlock did the one thing perhaps only someone like her could do in that moment. She pulled her phone from her expensive handbag and began dialing with fingers that did not tremble. She still did not understand, or deliberately refused to allow herself to understand, the seriousness of what she had just caused. And her first instinct was not to bend down and see whether the old woman was all right, not to apologize, but to defend herself, to attack, to immediately raise the familiar wall of money and lawyers she had hidden behind all her life. She pressed the phone to her ear, and in the sharp, cold voice that had regained its control, she told someone on the other end to call her lawyer at once, that there had been an incident at the restaurant, and some senile old woman had thrown herself at her and fallen, that the staff here were trying to blame her, and that she needed her people present before anyone had time to invent anything else. She said those words loudly enough for the whole room to hear, as though declaring her own version of the truth with enough confidence would make it true, and she swept her eyes around the watching guests with a challenging look, memorizing each face, as though warning that anyone who dared testify against her would regret it. August rose from beside his mother, slowly, and turned to face Cordelia, and his silence in that moment was so heavy that even Cordelia, who had never known how to fear anyone, stopped short in the middle of her sentence. He did not move toward her in a threatening way, did not clench his fists, did not raise his voice. He only stood there with his steel-colored eyes fixed directly on her, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even, but every word fell through the silent room, like stones dropping into a still lake. He told her that the woman on the floor was his mother, and he said it not as a threat but as a simple truth. Yet it was that very simplicity that made it all the more frightening, because everyone in the room understood the weight of the words "my mother" when they came from this man's mouth. He went on to say that she could call as many lawyers as she liked, could build as many versions of the truth as she wished, but in this room tonight there were more than 30 people who had seen what she did with their own eyes, and no amount of money, no connection she had, could buy them all. He said he did not care who she knew, who her husband was, what family she came from, because all those things, the shield that had protected her for an entire lifetime, would mean nothing from this moment on. And then he said the final sentence, more quietly than all the others, that she should remember very carefully the face of the woman in the apron who had caught his mother, because that girl had just done the decent thing that all of Cordelia's fortune could never buy, And that was the difference between the two of them. A difference she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Cordelia opened her mouth to answer, the arrogance inside her still refusing to yield, and she stammered something about suing this entire restaurant, about no one having the right to speak to her in that tone, but her voice had lost its old power, and the words fell weak and out of place into the room, no longer frightening anyone. The whole room looked at her, and for the first time in a life accustomed to obedience, Cordelia Whitlock faced something she had never tasted before. The silent judgment in the eyes of dozens of people, not fearful respect, not submission, but quiet contempt for someone who had exposed the whole of who she was, and though she still held her head high, still gripped the phone in her hand like a final weapon, everyone could see that the ground beneath her feet had begun to crack. Not long after that, 2 Boston police officers stepped into the restaurant, bringing with them the cold air and the snowflakes still clinging to their shoulders. Because Ted Morrow had called them from the first moments, he realized the situation had gone beyond his ability to handle. They entered with professional calm, and after exchanging a few brief words with Ted, the pianist, and several nearby diners, their faces gradually grew more serious, because the story they heard from dozens of witnesses matched in every detail, with no contradiction a lawyer could exploit. One of the 2 officers walked over to Margaret, who had now been helped by Ruby and August into a chair, and had the wool shawl wrapped back around her shoulders, and he gently asked after her condition with the admirable tenderness of someone who understood that the person before him was a vulnerable victim who needed to be treated carefully. The other officer approached Cordelia, took out his notebook, and began informing her of what was being recorded, that multiple witnesses had described conduct that caused harm to an elderly person with an illness and a disturbance of public order, and that she would need to come with them to clarify the matter. Cordelia immediately flared up, her voice rising again into that shrill pitch, declaring that this was blatant slander, that she was the victim, that she would make everyone involved pay, and she kept repeating her lawyer's name like a spell. But the officers only wrote patiently and answered in calm voices that she had every right to a lawyer and could present all of that at the station. It was right in the middle of this that the restaurant door opened again, and a man in his 50s wearing a business suit stepped inside, snow covering his shoulders, his face marked by the fatigue of a late meeting, and his eyes searched the room until he saw Cordelia surrounded by the police. It was her husband, Mr. Whitlock, who had just received a frantic message and rushed over, and in the first instant, his face held the annoyed confusion of a powerful man accustomed to cleaning up the trouble his wife caused. But then, as he moved deeper into the dining room and truly saw the whole scene, saw the silver-haired old woman trembling in the chair with tears still in her eyes, saw the girl in the apron with a scrape on her arm standing beside her protectively, and especially when his gaze met the face of the man standing silently nearby, something inside him collapsed, because unlike his wife, Mr. Whitlock knew very well who August Fenn was, and he understood at once and completely the abyss his family had just fallen into. But what surprised the whole room was not the fear that appeared on his face. It was what he did next, because instead of rushing to defend his wife, instead of pulling out his phone to call a lawyer the way Cordelia had done, Mr. Whitlock slowly walked over to Margaret, and before everyone's stunned eyes, he lowered himself onto one knee on the stone floor right in front of the old woman, bringing himself down to her eye level, a wealthy man in an expensive suit kneeling on the restaurant floor. He spoke to Margaret in a choked and sincere voice, asking her to forgive what had happened to her that night, saying there were no words that could excuse it, that he was deeply, deeply sorry, and his eyes reddened as he said those words. Margaret looked at him with gentle bewilderment, perhaps not fully understanding what was happening, but she felt the tenderness in his voice, and she nodded faintly, reaching out with her wrinkled hand to pat his hand as though comforting him, and that gesture of unconditional forgiveness from the old woman made the grown man lower his head to hide his emotion. And so, in the same room, in the same moment, 2 people carrying the Whitlock name showed the whole world 2 completely opposite natures. A woman who had caused harm and did not know how to bow her head, and a man who had committed no wrong himself, yet was willing to kneel and ask forgiveness on behalf of the person he had bound his life to. After the police had taken Cordelia outside to complete the procedures, and the commotion gradually settled, August found Ruby, who had by then helped Margaret sit safely, and was quietly gathering up the broken pieces of the evening with hands that were still trembling slightly. He stood before her, and for the first time since that terrible moment, the frightening calm on his face had faded, giving way to something softer, almost the awkwardness of a man unused to owing anyone a debt of kindness. He thanked her in simple but sincere words, saying that she had done something he would never forget, that she had protected his mother when he had not been there, and then he offered to repay her, not with empty thanks, but with something that could truly change her life. He said he knew she was carrying heavy burdens, and when he said that, he paused briefly, because a loose piece from earlier had just clicked into place in his mind, the soft voice he had accidentally heard out in the lobby at the beginning of the evening, the name Eli, the way the girl had spoken about saving money so someone could see a better doctor. And now he understood that the girl who had caught his mother was also carrying another life on her shoulders. He said plainly that he was willing to take care of all the medical expenses for her younger brother, that to him it was only a small number, but to her it could be everything, and that he did not consider it charity, but the least he could do to repay a debt of gratitude. Ruby went still when she heard him mention Eli, because she had not known he had overheard her call, and for one moment the temptation of that offer nearly overwhelmed her, because it was exactly what she had longed for day and night, the burden she silently carried through every shift, the future of the little brother she loved more than her own life. But then she drew in a deep breath, lifted her head to look at him, and shook it gently but firmly, saying that she was deeply grateful for his kindness. But she couldn't accept it, because what she had done tonight had not been done in exchange for anything, and if she took his money, then the moment she held his mother would become a transaction, and she did not want that. She said she had caught the old woman not because she was the mother of a powerful man, but because she was a human being who needed help. And if Ruby accepted a reward for that, she would lose the very reason she had done it. August looked at her for a long while, and in his eyes appeared a respect that very few people in this world had ever received from him, because he was far too accustomed to a world where everyone had a price, where every kindness hid a calculation, and standing before him now was a poor girl with nothing in her hands, refusing the very thing that could save her life, just so she could preserve the purity of a single act of grace. He then asked her that if there was one thing she could wish for, what would it be? Ruby thought for a moment, and replied that her only desire was that when this incident was written down, when it was entered into the record and retold by others, please let people understand that his mother was not some senile old woman deserving to be shooed away the way that woman had said, but a whole human being, someone who had once taught piano, a mother who carried a lifetime of love in her heart, and that her illness was not something shameful. She said the final sentence very softly but clearly, that his mother's dignity wasn't her failing, and those words hung in the air between them like something sacred, making the powerful man who had once made the entire city lower its eyes, turn his face away for a moment to hide the sudden sting in his eyes. When the room had settled back into silence and the guests slowly found their breath again, something no one expected happened, because Margaret, who was still sitting on the chair in a daze, suddenly stood and took slow steps toward the piano in the corner, the place from which the music had been calling to her all evening like a whisper from the past. August started to follow and support his mother, but Ruby gently placed a hand on his arm and shook her head slightly, as if to say, "Let her go," and the son stopped, watching his mother with eyes full of both worry and hope. Margaret sat down on the piano bench, her wrinkled, trembling hands lifting and hovering above the ivory keys for a moment, as though even she wasn't sure she still remembered what to do. But then, when those fingertips touched the keys, a miracle took place, because the memory that illness had stolen from her almost completely had somehow remained hidden in a place deeper than ordinary remembrance, inside the very hands that had repeated these movements tens of thousands of times for nearly 40 years, and her hands began to glide across the keys without needing her to command them. A melody rose, hesitant in its first notes, and then growing clearer and more certain with each passing breath. An old song so beautiful it made the heart ache, and in that moment, the woman who was slowly being lost inside the white fog suddenly became entirely herself again, her back straightening, her face glowing with a peace no one had seen in her all evening, as though in music she had found again the part of herself illness had seemed to take away. The whole room fell silent to listen, not with the fearful caution that had filled it when August entered, but with sincere emotion, and it was then that the young mother led her 5-year-old son back in from the outer lobby, because peace had returned, and the child could now safely be present, and the little boy let go of his mother's hand and walked over to stand quietly beside the piano, lifting his clear eyes to the old woman playing music with all the innocent wonder only a child could have. August stood there watching his mother, and the tears that powerful man had held back all evening finally rolled down in silence, because it had been so very long since he had seen his mother like this. Ruby stepped closer to the piano, and when the music reached its final notes and slowly faded into the room, she pulled the linen handkerchief embroidered with the letter R from her apron pocket, the last keepsake from her late mother, and gently placed it into Margaret's trembling hand, folding the old woman's wrinkled fingers around the cloth, a gift given for no reason other than love between two people who had recognized each other through a shared grief. Later, people would record all the events of that night in written reports, and those words would say that Cordelia Whitlock was charged for harming an elderly person with an illness and disturbing public order, that a name once spoken with respect in the city's upper circles was now mentioned only with contempt, that the Whitlock family, not long afterward, quietly lost the lease on expensive office floors in a building that turned out to belong to August Fenn himself, and that somewhere, an anonymous fund silently paid every medical expense for a 12-year-old boy with a heart condition in Vermont. Something Ruby would only dimly begin to guess many months later. When she finally wondered who had stood behind it, those were the facts. They existed in records, in conversations, in the memories of dozens of people who had been present that night. But what mattered most to Ruby was not the punishment of that arrogant woman, nor even the silent money that saved her brother's future, but the image of an old woman slipping into forgetfulness, finding herself again through a piece of music. The clear eyes of a child believing that music and kindness were the proper human response to this world. And the simple truth Ruby had always believed, that a person's dignity had never been, and would never be, measured by the money they owned, but by the way they treated someone who could give them nothing in return. Tonight's story reminds us of something simple but profound, that true kindness does not wait for a reward, that tenderness toward the vulnerable is the truest measure of a soul, and that every human being, whether old, ill, poor, or nameless, deserves to be seen and cherished as a whole person. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share so we can listen to many more meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about tonight's story? About Ruby, about August, and about that poor elderly mother? Please leave a few lines in the comments below, because we always hope to hear the honest feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for listening all the way to the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful, peaceful life, filled with love every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.